On Wednesday the 2nd of November in 2022, a 17-year-old boy named Cion Carroll left his grandmother's house in the early hours of the morning to cool off after the pair had got into a small argument, but unfortunately, he was never seen alive again. Cion was reported missing the next day by his mother Tiffany Baker after he failed to return home and refused to answer his cell phone. So, concerned for his well-being, the whole family headed out to the small town of Kenbridge in Virginia to hand out flyers and look for the missing teenager. However, after 8 days of searching, they were mortified to find out that a police officer named Ben Barnes would miraculously stumble upon a gravesite in which he would discover the dismembered remains of Cion Carroll. But this already controversial case would take yet another shocking twist when it was revealed that Cion's cell phone had pinged next to the home of a registered sex offender, leading the public to believe that it wouldn't be too long before the case was wrapped up. But to everyone's surprise, this suspect was quickly removed from the registry, with his identity remaining a secret to this day. And to make matters even worse, the police officer responsible for finding Cion's body would coincidentally decide to resign without explanation before disappearing into thin air. So, given the incredibly suspicious nature of this case, it is no surprise that Cion's family have continued to plead with the public for help, as it would seem that something nefarious is certainly going down in Kenbridge, Virginia. Cion Carroll was born on the 18th of February in 2005 to his loving mother Tiffany Baker in the state of Virginia alongside his 2 siblings. Little is known about his younger years, but what we do know is that his family described him as an incredibly happy child that loved his family and enjoyed spending time with his friends. However, as Cion moved into adolescence, it would soon become clear that the same kids he had been associating with for all those years had adopted some rather dangerous traits, which would begin to get the friendship group into a whole world of trouble. Cion grew up in the town of Richmond in Virginia, known for having one of the highest crime rates in America, with 38 crimes occurring per 1,000 residents. So it wasn't too much of a surprise to see that Cion himself would eventually be sucked into that world by proxy, as he would soon find himself in the middle of a fatal shootout. It is unknown if there were any convictions to come off the back of this incident, but it was confirmed that Cion was not the shooter, and therefore he was eventually released from police custody and sent back home. But fearful that it wouldn't be long before another incident like this would occur, Cion's mother Tiffany decided it would be for the best to send her boy to live with his grandmother 60 miles away in the town of Kenbridge, as she believed this was the necessary change of pace he needed to protect his future. However, despite her efforts to protect her son, it would seem that there was nothing she could do to prevent the inevitable, as just a few weeks after moving in with his grandmother, an event would occur that would shake the fabric of the small town of Kenbridge and break an entire community's heart. On Tuesday the 1st of November, in the later hours of the evening, the 17-year-old was startled when his grandmother suddenly approached him to complain about the fact that he had left his jackets in a pile on the floor. But in typical teenage fashion, Cion responded with anger, and soon enough the pair began arguing over the situation, which eventually ended when the young man decided to head up to his room. His grandmother then reported the incident to his mother Tiffany, who was severely concerned about his behaviour and immediately called his cell phone to speak to him about it. But due to the nature of their close relationship, Tiffany was able to break through to her son, and after calming him down, managed to convince him to apologise and make up with his grandmother. The fact was, Tiffany knew that Cion had been struggling lately due to his affiliation with the shooting a few weeks prior, so his behaviour wasn't necessarily too surprising. However, nobody could have been prepared for what would happen next, as after apologising to his grandmother, Cion would decide to head out the back door, never to be seen alive again. On Wednesday the 2nd of November, Cion's grandmother would wake to find that her 17-year-old grandson was nowhere to be seen, despite her assumption that he had simply gone out to the backyard to cool off the night before. Cion was well known to go out to the tool shed at the end of the yard where he would hang out with friends, so it would be safe to say that it wasn't too out of the ordinary for Cion to spend a lot of time out there. But to her horror, the situation would only get worse when she would attempt to call the troubled teenager to find out where he was, only to be continuously ignored throughout the day. So, concerned for his safety, Cion's grandmother decided to call Tiffany to ask if she had perhaps heard from him, but to her dismay, she too had not been able to get a hold of Cion, eventually leaving the family with no choice but to report him missing to the Cambridge Police Department. According to Tiffany Baker, the police didn't seem too interested, as rather than looking for Cion, they instead provided her with a list of different scenarios on what could have happened, most of which Tiffany felt could never be true based on her knowledge of her son. However, eventually officers were later sent out to the scene to take a report, and after speaking with his grandmother, the police officially began their investigation into the disappearance. But what had started as a simple case of a likely runaway would soon evolve into something much darker, as a detail would be revealed that would shock the entire community. On Friday the 4th of November, Cion's family had been spending the day searching for the teenage boy, handing out flyers and speaking to the locals in an attempt to gain some much-needed leads in his disappearance. But despite their efforts, it seemed that nobody was able to provide any useful evidence, leaving the family frustrated and desperate, as with each passing hour, the danger surrounding Cion's case was increasing. So, keen to try everything they could, somebody then suggested tracking down Cion's cell phone, with the idea that it would lead them to the missing young man. So the family then pulled up the Find My iPhone app and were directed to an unusual place. However, after tracing the cell phone's last ping and being led to a home on Poorhouse Road, they would soon find out that the house belonged to a Tier 3 offender. So after learning this harrowing news, Tiffany Baker, along with the rest of the family, immediately approached the door to ask why the cell phone had pinged so close to their residence. But upon answering, the people inside simply denied that the phone was there, eventually demanding that Cion's family leave the property. But refusing to accept defeat, Cion's family decided to take their evidence to the police, and also spread the word to the local news outlets in the hopes that this would spur on some more investigation. However, despite the daunting evidence that they had brought forward, the police didn't feel it was substantial enough to warrant a house search, and then just a few days later, this unknown offender would mysteriously disappear from the registry, understandably causing the community to start asking questions of the authorities. Now, at the time, the case was being handled by a department within the Cambridge Town Police consisting of Chief Ben Barnes and a handful of supporting officers. But when confronted with some serious questions by the media after they caught wind of the story, Ben Barnes suspiciously refused to comment, explaining that he didn't have time to speak as he was out actively searching for Cion. So you can imagine how the community felt when just a few days later, none other than Chief Ben Barnes would suddenly announce a horrifying discovery. On Saturday the 12th of November, officers were called out to the scene of a crime located on the 200 block of Sea Way, just a 5-minute drive away from where Cion's cell phone had last pinged. According to Chief Ben Barnes, he had been coincidentally walking down the road when he unexpectedly spotted something unusual on the side of the road. Upon further examination, he noticed that the ground had been clearly filled in, and using his police training, he was able to deduce that something had been buried beneath the surface. So, after taking his shovel out the back of his vehicle, he began to dig, but it didn't take long before he noticed what appeared to be the remains of a person. Once the other officers arrived on the scene, the body was then carefully exhumed by the crime scene investigation squad, at which point they soon learned that the remains had to belong to a young man. It was also discovered that the body had been dismembered at the joints, shot multiple times and covered with lye, alongside a small amount of concrete mix. So it would be safe to say that the police immediately knew that they had a killer on their hands. But despite the wealth of evidence that surrounded the case, somehow, the police did not have a single person of interest, and to make matters even worse, the police officer that found the body, Chief Ben Barnes, would mysteriously decide to resign from his post with no explanation, exactly 2 months after the discovery. So, 19 months on from this horrific tragedy, the police are still no closer to finding out what really happened to Cion Carroll. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But in the time since his discovery, Cion's family have been doing everything they can to raise awareness about his case, in their unwavering search for closure. So hopefully it will only be a matter of time before the truth finally comes out. However, given that it has now been almost 2 years since Cion's body was discovered, alongside the fact that no arrests have been made and no suspects have even been mentioned by the police, I can't help but feel that the likelihood of his family receiving the answers they so desperately deserve is only growing weaker as the days pass. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before we get into the theories themselves, I wanted to quickly express my deepest sympathies for Tiffany Baker and the rest of the family. Based on the evidence, it seems so clear to me that the police are holding something back in this case, so it must be so frustrating to go almost 2 years without any answers, especially when the people who are employed to protect you are not doing their jobs. If you're familiar with my channel, then you will likely know I have talked about police incompetence in the past, and frequently it seems to be the reason why so many people remain missing or their cases remain unsolved forever. But I truly hope this isn't going to be the case for Cion's family, as I have personally spoken with Tiffany myself and I know just how desperate they are for answers. So with this in mind, is this really just a simple case of police incompetence? Or could there be something more nefarious at play? I think we can all agree that the behaviour of the police to refuse further inspection after Cion's cell phone was located by a registered sex offender's house was questionable at best and reprehensible at worst. The whole point of adding offenders to a registry is to keep an eye on them and make sure they don't reoffend. So the fact that a missing young man's cell phone had pinged right next to the home of a convicted criminal, you would think that this would warrant as enough probable cause to have them search the residence. And yet, this man has never been interviewed, and to this day, the name of the registered sex offender has been scrubbed from every database, meaning we will never know their identity, and therefore, it will be much more difficult to decipher if they could have been involved in Cion's death. But taking a step away from this theory, I suppose it could be possible that this detail is merely a distraction from the truth, as one idea that has been posed by the community is that the guilty suspect could be none other than the police themselves. So with this idea in mind, one question that I feel we need to be asking here is whether or not the police officer who found Cion's body could have been the culprit, and if so, could the police have covered up the murder in order to protect a fellow officer? Well, in my opinion, it is certainly possible, as you simply cannot ignore the coincidental fact that Cion's body was discovered in an area nobody had thought to look. Also, when questioned by the media, Chief Ben Barnes refused to explain why he was looking in this particular area at the time, which was made even more suspicious after he mysteriously resigned from his post just 2 months on from the discovery. Now, it should be said that it's possible he was just feeling the pressure of the community asking questions, and due to Cambridge only being a small town of just over 1,000 residents, maybe he wasn't used to this kind of pressure and eventually just gave in. But before I cut him too much slack, I do think it's incredibly odd that after spending years building his career to become a chief of police, he would just walk away as easy as that, with no explanation, before evaporating into thin air. This tells me that he may be hiding something, and maybe he wants to remain out of the spotlight to prevent people from pointing the finger at him. But for argument's sake, let's say he was responsible for Cion's death. Wouldn't the Cambridge police have known right away, given that they would have been able to track his movements on the day of Cion's disappearance? Well, on the one hand, you could say that this proves his innocence, but a skeptic could also say that it is just as possible that the police could have covered it all up, as they didn't want the story to tarnish their reputation as a police department. In reality, we may never know the truth here, as I find it hard to believe that a police officer would ever turn on their fellow officers, especially after 2 years. So if this is the case, I fear that the truth will never be revealed. But before I get too carried away blaming a man that may very well be innocent after all this, I feel it would only be fair to hypothesize some of the other theories, such as the fact that Cion could have been killed by somebody a little closer to home. Now, one point I feel should be mentioned here is that we need to remember Cion was living with his grandmother for a reason, which was to escape his past involvement with a shootout back in Richmond, Virginia. We don't know what his involvement was exactly, but it could very well be possible that Cion was hunted down and killed because he was a key witness to that shooting just a few weeks earlier. Well, it's difficult to say for certain, as this isn't a theory that has been talked about too much online, and the only real connection here is that Cion had some nefarious friends back at home. But he was living 60 miles away at the time, so it would seem to be a stretch to imagine somebody traversing that distance to silence Cion. Unless, of course, there is more to this shootout incident than we've been told. But without any evidence, I don't feel comfortable taking this theory any further out of respect to his family. However, one other detail which I loosely touched on earlier in this video was the fact that Cion's grandmother saw him go out the back door the night he disappeared, and he was well known to spend a lot of time at the toolshed where he would hang out with his friend Branden. So she was not concerned when she saw him leave in the early hours of the morning, as she just assumed he was somewhere still on the property. But a key point to make here is that the very same friend that Cion would hang out with in the shed would also mysteriously turn up deceased just 1 day after Cion's body was discovered. Now, whether or not there is a connection between their cases is heavily disputed by the Cambridge Police Department, as they seem to be adamant that Branden was not killed by anybody, as his death was self-inflicted. However, given the fact that 2 young black men died within days of each other is coincidental enough, but given that they were good friends living in the same area, surely this is something worth looking deeper into. Now, I'm not sure how comfortable Branden's family would be with me sharing his information, so I think I will veer on the side of caution here to avoid causing any unwanted distress. But I do think this is a very interesting piece of evidence, and leads me to wonder if there could be a possibility that both men were victims of the same person. Either way though, the fact still remains that whoever Cion's killer was is likely still out there roaming the streets, so we have to continue sharing his story to as many people as we can, in the hopes that his family can get the closure they not only deserve, but have earned, through their continuous, unwavering efforts to seek out justice for their loved one. So with this in mind, I will leave a link to their GoFundMe page in the description below, as I'm sure Cion's family would greatly appreciate any support you can provide them in their quest for answers. Anyway, on that note, I think I'll leave this video here, but if you have any other theories of your own that you think may help explain what really happened to Cion Carroll, please leave your comments down below and I'll do my best to get back to you. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for updates on these stories. Also, if you're from the state of Virginia, or you just found this story interesting, feel free to check out the videos on screen now, which cover the cases of Darius Appiah and Daquan Roundtree, who just like Cion Carroll were discovered deceased shortly after their disappearance, with their cases remaining unsolved to this day.